A 41-year-old man is hunting down his own replacement. And Kimi Antonelli should be terrified. Because the 19-year-old sitting in Lewis Hamilton's old seat, the one Mercedes groomed for years, the one who built a 50-point championship lead, just watched the man he replaced win a Grand Prix in a car nobody trusted. At an age when every single driver on the grid is supposed to be slowing down. So this week, Formula One did something it never does. It sat down 6 of the greatest drivers who ever lived and asked them one question. Is Lewis Hamilton actually back? 6 different legends. 6 different careers. And one word kept coming up over and over again, a word that should send a chill down a 19-year-old spine. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why. Not long ago, Kimi Antonelli walked straight into Hamilton's old seat, built that 50-point lead, and for half a season it looked exactly like what everyone predicted, the changing of the guard. Then Hamilton won in Barcelona, in a Ferrari nobody trusted, at 41 years old. Now 6 of the sport's greatest living legends have looked at what's coming after the break, and the word they keep repeating about Hamilton is the one word that should terrify that kid the most. If you'd walked through the paddock this spring and said the name Lewis Hamilton, you'd have gotten the same look from almost everyone. A little sympathy, a slow nod, the kind of face people make when a great fighter has stayed one fight too long. One brutal first year at Ferrari. A car that fought him at every corner. And a teenager sitting in his old Mercedes, running away with everything. The story wrote itself. The old king had handed over the crown, and he'd done it in the wrong colors. That was the read back in April. It isn't the read anymore. Because this week, Formula One did something it almost never does. It sat 6 of the greatest drivers who ever lived in front of a camera, one by one, and asked them to judge the season so far. Emerson Fittipaldi, Damon Hill, Gerhard Berger, Juan Pablo Montoya, Thierry Boutsen, Stefan Johansson. Between them, world titles, dozens of race wins, decades spent inside this sport. These aren't pundits filling airtime. These are men who have actually lived the thing they're being asked to judge. And when the conversation turned to Hamilton, every single one of them said some version of the same sentence. He's back. And the timing couldn't be worse for the driver out front. The math still says Hamilton is second. 169 points after 11 rounds, 50 behind Antonelli, with 11 races still left to run. On paper, that's a mountain. It gets steeper when you look at the teams, because Mercedes isn't just leading the Drivers' Championship, they're running away with the Constructors' title too, well clear of Ferrari. So the legends weren't watching a man cruising in the best car on the grid. They were watching something far more interesting, a driver dragging more out of his machine than it has any business giving him, at an age when everyone assumed the opposite would be true. To understand why the tone flipped so hard, you only need one afternoon in June. 686 days. That's how long Lewis Hamilton had gone without winning a Formula One race. That's not a slump, that's the longest drought of his entire career, the kind of number that quietly follows a driver into retirement. And then, in Barcelona, in a red car half the grid had already written off, he ended it. At 41, he became the oldest man to win a Grand Prix since 1970, the first time in more than half a century anyone that age had stood on the top step. Beside him on the podium stood 2 more British drivers, the first all-British podium the sport had seen since 1968. It was the kind of afternoon that makes even neutral fans stop and remember exactly why this man is called the greatest of his generation. And 4 laps from the end of that same race, the teenager leading the championship pulled off the track and parked it. Stefan Johansson watched that win and didn't hesitate to call it. A classic Hamilton victory, he said, the mark of a champion, the kind of driver who can take a 2% opportunity and turn it into everything. Think about what he's really saying there. Not that Hamilton had the fastest car. Not that it fell into his lap. But that when a sliver of a chance opened up, Hamilton was the one man on the grid ruthless enough to grab it with both hands. That's not a compliment you hand a driver who's finished. And Johansson didn't stop there. The championship, he said, is far from over. And there's a reason that line landed so hard. Because a title this year wouldn't just be another trophy on Hamilton's shelf. He already shares the record for most drivers' championships in history. One more from here, at 41, in a Ferrari, against the very kid who replaced him, would put him alone at the top of a mountain nobody else has ever climbed. That's the prize sitting quietly behind this entire charge, and every driver on that panel knows exactly what it would mean. So why did a man everyone buried in the spring suddenly look like a threat again? Part of the answer sits in the car underneath him. Part of it is the whole season changing shape. Fittipaldi put it bluntly. Last year, he said, everybody was criticizing Lewis. He can't beat Leclerc, he's too old, they said it all. Fittipaldi heard every word of it, and now, in his words, Hamilton is going strong. The two-time world champion sounded almost relieved saying it out loud. He said he was genuinely happy to see Lewis and Ferrari flying again. But Fittipaldi added something sharper, something that matters for everything still to come. This year, the sport tore up its rulebook and started over. Smaller cars. Lighter cars. A completely new power unit leaning far harder on its electric side than anything before it. Less grip, less downforce. And a car with less downforce rewards exactly the thing Hamilton has always had more of than almost anyone else on the grid: car control, feel, the ability to catch a machine sliding underneath him and carry speed through it anyway. For a decade, the sport handed everyone enormous grip and made cars easier to drive right on the limit. This season, it clawed a huge chunk of that back, and it turned out a lot of the field had been leaning on that grip without even realizing it. Fittipaldi believes that reset quietly shifted the ground back under Hamilton's feet, back toward the exact kind of driving that made him a champion in the first place. It's worth sitting with how big this change actually was. These are the deepest regulation changes the sport has seen in a generation. Cars shedding weight, giving up a slice of their downforce, switching to a power unit where the electric side now does almost half the work, nearly 3 times what it used to. Overnight, an entire grid of drivers had to relearn how to be fast. Some of them never fully adjusted. Hamilton, on the evidence of the last few months, adjusted better than almost anyone expected, and a great deal better than a 41-year-old was supposed to. Berger saw the same shift. He said he was genuinely happy for Lewis, because it had been such a difficult stretch for him, and now, in Berger's words, it looks like he's coming out of the corner. Coming out of the corner, from a 10-time Grand Prix winner, is not small talk. That's a man who knows exactly how these things turn. What makes the charge more impressive, not less, is the car itself. Ferrari haven't handed Hamilton a rocket ship. On raw straight-line speed, the red car has been down on the very best all year, and Hamilton himself has admitted to losing several tenths a lap purely on power down the longest straights. That's a real deficit. On some tracks, the difference between a win and a distant fourth. So when the legends talk about Hamilton flying, they're not describing a man in a class of his own. They're describing a man beating a car that isn't quite good enough, over and over, purely on skill and racecraft, which is exactly why it frightens them on Antonelli's behalf. Imagine what he does once Ferrari finally closes that gap. And there's one more thing that makes this whole fight sting. The kid out front isn't a stranger to Hamilton. He's his replacement. When Hamilton left for Ferrari, Mercedes handed his seat to Kimi Antonelli, the teenager they'd been quietly grooming for years. Hamilton praised him, championed him, told the world the boy was special. Antonelli, for his part, kept insisting he wanted to write his own story, that it wasn't right to see him as anyone's replacement. He wanted to be Kimi, not the next Lewis. The problem is, the story wrote a twist neither of them planned for. The mentor didn't fade quietly into the sunset. He switched teams, endured one miserable year, and came out the other side hunting the very driver who took his old car. There was even a moment back at Monaco, earlier in the season, where Hamilton reportedly told Antonelli he was catching up to him. At the time, it sounded like a veteran being generous to a rising star. Read it again now, with Hamilton charging and 6 legends lining up behind him, and it sounds like something else entirely. And it isn't only Hamilton carrying the weight of this fight. Ferrari haven't won a drivers' championship since 2007, a drought dragging on for the better part of 2 decades now. A whole generation of tifosi has grown up watching the most famous name in motorsport come close, again and again, and fall short. Hamilton didn't cross over to Ferrari to finish second to a teenager in his old car. He went there to end that drought and write the last great chapter of his career in red. That's the story the legends can feel building underneath the numbers, and it's exactly why none of them will let it go. This is where the panel stopped sounding like fans and started sounding like a warning. Damon Hill looked past the summer break entirely. What's coming, he said, is a decider, a tipping point, and the pressure, in his words, is going to be huge. Hill wasn't describing a comfortable cruise to the flag. He was describing the whole fight bending toward the one man who thrives when the pressure climbs, because Hill knows exactly what Hamilton is made of, and he didn't dress it up. Cream always rises to the top, he said. And then the line that traveled around the paddock all week. You cut Lewis Hamilton in half, Hill said, and it just says, competitor, the whole way through. That's not nostalgia. That's a cold, clear-eyed read from a world champion who raced against the best of his own era. Hamilton himself is saying the quiet part out loud. There's still a lot of work to do, he admits. Still a mountain to climb in the second half of the season. But then the part that should really travel. He says he's more focused than ever, that he genuinely believes he can fight for this, and this, he points out, is usually where his seasons get stronger. The back half has always been his territory. Look at the shape of his career, and he isn't wrong. Time and again, Hamilton has come out of the summer break a different animal, stringing together the runs that decided championships. The man chasing 50 points now is the same man who has closed bigger gaps than this, in cars that weren't always the best on the grid. Notice, too, who's dropped out of this conversation entirely. At the start of the year, this looked like it could be a 5 or 6 car scrap for the title. It isn't anymore. Leclerc, Norris, Verstappen, one by one, they've slipped off the pace of the two Mercedes and the one charging Ferrari. The field has quietly narrowed down to a single storyline, the prodigy out front and the veteran hunting him down. Everyone else is now racing for the leftovers, which means the only man on the grid with a realistic shot at stopping Antonelli is the exact driver the legends just spent a week praising. So the real question from here is simple. Who's actually standing between Hamilton and this championship, and can he take the heat? The honest answer is that Antonelli has been, for most of the year, genuinely brilliant, and pretending otherwise would insult anyone watching. He's won 6 races in 2026, 5 of them in a row, from China all the way through Monaco, a streak that made him the youngest driver ever to lead a Formula One championship and the youngest ever to win at Monaco. He took pole in China as the youngest pole sitter the sport has ever seen. He took Hamilton's old seat and didn't just fill it, he set it alight. If he holds on, he breaks a record that stood for over a decade, becoming the youngest world champion the sport has ever produced, younger even than Sebastian Vettel was. Every single one of the legends sees the talent clearly. Fittipaldi says the kid is doing a fantastic job, that at 19 he can genuinely win this championship. Montoya, never a man to hand out praise cheaply, calls him bloody quick. Nobody on that panel thinks Antonelli is a fluke. But Boutsen slipped in a detail that's easy to miss. Antonelli, he said, is very aggressive right now, and in 3 or 4 years, he'll drive very differently. It sounds like a throwaway line. It isn't. What Boutsen is describing is a young driver still running on raw instinct, still learning where the actual edge is. That works beautifully when you're winning, loose and free. It's a very different thing when the walls start closing in. And there's a version of this fight that never comes down to raw pace at all. If these two end up side by side, wheel to wheel into a braking zone with a championship riding on it, one of them has lived that exact moment 100 times. The other has never lived it once with this much on the line. Hamilton has spent 20 years winning the races where nerve matters more than horsepower. That experience doesn't show up in a qualifying lap. It shows up on the Sunday afternoons that actually decide titles. Because this is the question none of them can truly answer for him. What happens when the pressure actually lands? For all 6 wins, Antonelli has never once lost a title fight, not because he keeps winning them, but because he's never been in one. He's never driven the second half of a season carrying a 50-point lead with the greatest driver of his generation growing in his mirrors, race after race, refusing to go away. That's a very specific kind of heat, and nobody in that car has felt it before. Pressure does strange things to young drivers. It's not that they suddenly forget how to drive, it's that the margins shrink. The overtake you'd normally take, you leave. The corner you'd normally attack, you protect. And the moment a driver starts guarding a lead instead of extending it, the man behind can smell it from half a straight away. Every great champion has a story about the season the pressure broke someone standing in front of them. Antonelli has never once been on the wrong side of that story. He's about to find out which kind of driver he really is. The cracks have already flickered once. Go back to Barcelona. The same afternoon Hamilton ended his drought. Antonelli was running inside the fight, and then, with 4 laps to go, it was gone. A retirement on the exact weekend his main rival stood on the top step. In a season where he'd barely put a wheel wrong, the timing of that failure was almost too cruel. He'd led every step of the way. He hadn't yet learned what it feels like to be the one being hunted. And it isn't only Hamilton doing the hunting. Antonelli's own teammate is the other problem in that garage. George Russell opened the season by winning in Australia, then won again in Austria, and for a stretch, it was Russell, not Antonelli, who looked like Mercedes' true number one. Berger said Russell got a wake-up call from Antonelli. But that door swings both ways. A teammate who's already got the better of you once this year is a teammate who knows he can do it again. Montoya thinks that's the real pressure point. If Russell can find a way to match Kimi, he said, it could push the kid into an uncomfortable place, into mistakes. Damon Hill made almost the same point, with a memory of his own, comparing it to a young Jacques Villeneuve arriving at Williams beside him, then pointing out with a grin how that one ended, Hill finishing ahead of Villeneuve. So Russell, he said, has to find a way to do the same thing now. Boutsen, watching Russell scuffle through a rough patch, simply said, George will be back. To be fair, this isn't a clean one-way story, and pretending it is would be dishonest. Hamilton has handed points back this year too, a run of penalties before the break, including a pit lane speeding penalty in Hungary for going a whisker over the limit, cost him a stronger result and stretched Antonelli's lead from 45 points out to 50. If you're wondering how a tenth of a kilometer an hour ends up costing a man a podium, so is he. For Hamilton to actually climb this mountain, those sloppy weekends have to stop, and he knows that better than anyone. But strip it all back, and the trend is the one the legends keep circling back to. The kid is starting to feel it. The old champion is starting to fly. So everything now points at one date. In 3 weeks, the season restarts at Zandvoort for the Dutch Grand Prix, and it's a sprint weekend, which means extra points on the table and more chances for that 50-point gap to move in a single afternoon. For the driver doing the chasing, a sprint weekend is a gift, 2 bites at the apple instead of 1. It's also the last time the sport will ever race at Zandvoort, which loads the whole day with even more weight. This is the moment the legends were really talking about. Not the 11 rounds behind us, but the 11 still ahead. Fittipaldi called the rest of the year a roll of the dice that could still land either way, and said he genuinely hopes Lewis challenges for this championship. Coming from a man who's watched every great driver of the last 50 years come and go, that is not a throwaway line. The car should suit Hamilton even more from here, the kind of circuits where feel matters more than raw straight-line grunt. The Zandvoort format hands him extra points to hunt. The history of his own career says the back half is where he does his damage. And the teenager out front has never once had to defend anything from anyone, let alone from this. And that's the part the numbers hide. 50 points sounds enormous in the middle of summer. It's 2 race wins. 2 Sundays where Hamilton finishes ahead and one thing goes wrong for the car in front of him, and suddenly this is a straight fight with 9 rounds still to run. The legends can count. That's exactly why not one of them was willing to call this thing over. Boutsen didn't overthink it. Lewis is Lewis, he said. He deserves to be on top. And then the line that tells you everything about how these drivers really see him. As soon as the car gets better, Boutsen said, Hamilton makes it happen. He won in Barcelona the moment the machine finally came to him. The message underneath is blunt. Give this man a car that works, and he'll do the rest himself. That's the word the whole panel kept circling, the one running underneath everything from the very start. Not old. Not finished. Dangerous. Each of them, in their own way, described a driver you do not want to see filling your mirrors in the second half of a season. Fittipaldi hoping he challenges. Hill calling him a competitor to the core. Johansson calling Barcelona the mark of a champion. Berger watching him come out of the corner. Boutsen saying he belongs on top. 6 separate conversations. 1 shared conclusion. And that is exactly the problem for a 19-year-old holding a championship lead for the very first time in his life. It's one thing to build a 50-point gap when nobody is truly chasing you. It's another thing entirely to hold on to it when the man behind you is the one the greatest drivers alive just spent a week quietly warning you about. So the real question was never whether Hamilton is still fast enough. 6 world champions just answered that one for you. The real question is the one only 11 races can settle. What happens when the pressure finally lands on a teenager who's never felt it, against a man who has felt almost nothing else his entire career? Which one of them blinks first? We find out at Zandvoort in 3 weeks. And this time, nobody is writing Hamilton's ending for him.